In the 19th century, Hydesville was a typical little hamlet of New York State, and, like many small settlements of its kind, held no real notoriety across the country. This particular village, situated about 20 miles from the rising town of Rochester, consisted of a cluster of wooden houses of a very humble type. But one little house in particular was able to boast of something a little more unusual. Whispers and superstitions aside, it was not till shortly after the Fox family took up residence in December of 1847 that the problems with the house really came to head. It started with the rappings, not long rappings, but just the occasional knock here and there. Easy to dismiss as the wind, or put down to the house's age. But soon the noise became more frequent, louder, and soon graduated to what sounded like the movement of furniture, but with no obvious culprit. Every possible search was made, but still the rappings continued. Upon the night of March 31st, 1848, there was a very loud and continued outbreak of inexplicable sounds.
The noises were heard in all parts of the house. We heard footsteps in the pantry and walking downstairs. We could not rest, and then I concluded that the house must be haunted by some unhappy, restless spirit. I had often heard of such things, but I had never witnessed anything of the kind that I could not account for before.
It was on this night that one of the great points of psychic evolution was reached, for it was then that one of the couple's 3 daughters, young Kate Fox, challenged the unseen power, who she had dubbed Splitfoot, to repeat the snaps of her fingers.
Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do. Count 1, 2, 3, 4.
The sound instantly followed her with the same number of raps. When she stopped, the sound ceased for a short time. Then Margaret said in sport,
Now, do just as I do. Count 1, 2, 3, 4.
Striking one hand against the other at the same time, and then the raps came as before. She was afraid to repeat them. Then Kathy said in her childish simplicity,
Tomorrow is April Fool's Day, and it's somebody trying to fool us.
I asked the noise to rap my children's different ages. Instantly, each one of my children's ages was given correctly. Pausing between them sufficiently long to individualize them until the 7th, at which time a longer pause was made. And then 3 more empathic raps were given, corresponding to the age of the little one that died, which was my youngest child. I then asked, Is this a human being that answers my question so correctly? There was no rap. I asked, Is it a spirit? If it is, make 2 raps. The sounds were given as soon as the request was made. I then said, If it was an injured spirit, make 2 raps, which were instantly made. I asked, Were you injured in this house? The answer was given as before. I asked, Will you continue to rap if I call my neighbors and that they may hear it too? The raps were loud in the affirmative.
Mr. Fox called in Mrs. Redfield, the Fox's nearest neighbour, who was then treated to a display of the phenomenon.
Were you murdered? Raps affirmative. Can your murderer be brought to justice? No sound. Can he be punished by the law? No answer. If your murderer cannot be punished by the law, manifest it in raps. And the raps were made clearly and distinctly.
They would eventually get out of him that he had been murdered in the east bedroom about 5 years ago, and that the murder was committed by a man on a Tuesday night, and that the body was taken down to the cellar. On Saturday night, April 1st, they commenced digging in the cellar. They dug until they came to water, and then gave up. The knockings would stop for a few days, but before long would start up again, just as prominent as before. And so, in the summer of 1848, Mr. David Fox, with the assistance of friends, resumed digging in the cellar. At a depth of 5 feet, they found a plank, and further digging disclosed charcoal and quicklime, and finally human hair and bones, which were pronounced by expert medical testimony to belong to a human skeleton. Despite numerous searches, the rest of the bones could not be found anywhere in the household, and it would not be till years later William H. Hyde, a reputable citizen of Clyde, who came to own the house, would later discover an almost entire human skeleton between the earth and crumbling cellar walls. These discoveries settle the question forever and prove conclusively that there was a crime committed in the house, and when one examines the results of the 2 diggings, one can reconstruct the circumstance. It is clear in the first instance, the body was buried with quicklime in the centre of the cellar. Later, the criminal was alarmed by the fact that the place was too open for suspicion, and he dug up the body again, or the main part of it, and reburied it under the wall where it would have been more out of the way. The work had been done so hurriedly, however, or in such imperfect light, that some clear traces were left, as has been seen in the original grave. However, the discovery of the full body is skipping ahead, and the story of the Fox sisters did not conclude upon finding the bones in the cellar, and neither did the disturbances stop. But what they did do was move. The Fox family was seriously troubled by the ongoing disturbances, and soon sent the daughters to live in Rochester with their elder sister, Lee. But soon, the same sounds were heard, and the problems started up again. Every effort was made to conceal these manifestations from the public, but soon they became known. Lee, who was a teacher of music, was unable to continue her profession, and hundreds of people flocked to her house to witness the new marvels. Nearby households soon began to report on similar phenomenon. As the incident reports of manifestations and powers began to grow, the Fox sisters were reminded of an early communication a spirit guide had with them, declaring that these manifestations would not be confined to you, but would go all over the world. But at heart, they were very shy country girls, and did not wish to court any publicity, but as a means to appease the spirits, the girls would ultimately concede. And so, on November 14th, 1849, the spiritualists held their first meeting at the Corinthian Hall, the largest available in Rochester. So convinced with some of their failure, the Rochester Democrat is stated to have had its leading article prepared with the headline, "Entire Exposure of the Rapping Humbug." The results, however, caused the editor to hold the page. The committee reported that the raps were undoubted facts. However, the answers to the questions were reportedly
not altogether right nor altogether wrong. The raps came on walls and doors some distance from the girls, causing a sensible vibration. We entirely failed to find any means by which it could be done.
Another set of tests by a group of Methodist ladies, whose brutal methods include stripping girls to their underwear and tying their dresses to their ankles, was forced to report.
When they were standing on pillows with a handkerchief tied round the bottom of their dresses, tight to the ankles, we all heard the rapping on the wall and floor distinctly.
But this time, the committee testified that the questions had all been answered correctly. And despite further attempts by the press, church, and medical profession to prove otherwise, with no concrete way to disprove the Fox sisters' abilities, the movement went on and continued to grow in number. Well, at least for the time being, for the fall from grace for the Fox sisters was still a long way away. But that is a story for another day.
It is a remarkable, and to spiritualists, painful story. But it bears its own lessons and should be faithfully recorded. For some years, the two younger sisters, Kate and Margaret, gave seances at New York and other places, successfully meeting every test which was applied to them. Such was their success, they began attracting attention from those high up in society, including Horace Greeley, later a candidate for the United States presidency. Horace was deeply interested in them, and, convinced of their entire honesty, he is said to have furnished the funds by which the younger girl completed her very imperfect education. The girls were in demand, and obliged to all the requests put to them by the public, and to the investigators determined to catch them out. And, despite protests of their exhaustion, they found themselves being frequently offered wine in order to renew their jaded energy. But unbeknown to the eager public, the Fox family had a predisposition of alcoholism. But as Margaret began to grow tired of the relentless demands placed upon her, she chanced upon a reprieve in the form of Dr. Elisha Kane, a famous Arctic explorer whom she fell madly in love with. But Kane, as his first name might imply, was a man of Puritan faith, and Puritans believe that the Bible represents the absolute final word in spiritual inspiration. Suffice to say, Kane did not agree with Fox's profession, and formed the theory that her elder sister Lee was, for purpose of gain, exploiting the fraud. The pair finally wed in an unsanctified marriage ceremony that involved friends and a ring, but curious for Kane, no officiating clergyman. Was he perhaps embarrassed of his wife? The reason for this is not known. During their relationship, Kane would write numerous letters to Margaret and to her sister Kate. These letters, published in a book after his death, revealed that Kane continually reproached Margaret for living a life of deceit and hypocrisy.
Take my advice and never talk of the spirits, either to friends or strangers. You know that with all my intimacy with Maggie after a whole month's trial, I could make nothing of them. Therefore, they are a great mystery.
Interestingly, Kane never presents any theories, let alone evidence, to back up his fraud allegations. And neither is there any indication that Margaret ever confessed otherwise. To realise their position, one has to remember that they were little more than children, and quite ignorant of the philosophy of the subject. However, for all his, what would now be conceived as very controlling ways, Kane did have the girl's interests at heart, with one letter stating,
Tell Katie to drink no champagne, and you too, follow the same advice.
Sound counsel, which perhaps would have led to a different outcome for both the girls and the movement, had they followed it. But despite the constant barrage from the man she adored, Margaret would not denounce her powers. That is until 1857, when Dr. Kane died, and the widow, now calling herself Mrs. Fox Kane, forswore all phenomena for a time, and was received into the Roman Catholic Church. However, broken-hearted and almost penniless, eventually Margaret took to working as a medium once again, but the drinking also continued, and her health and her mental state began to decline. Kate continued to practice her craft on her own, all the time dealing with an increasing dependence on alcohol herself. In 1871, Kate Fox visited England thanks to the generosity of Mr. Charles F. Livermore, a prominent banker of New York. The trip was a gift of gratitude for the consolation he had received from her powers, and in order for her to advance the cause of spiritualism over the pond. While staying in London, Kate managed to find love, marrying Mr. Henry Jenkin, a Londoner, barrister at law, and an early adapter of spiritualism in England. Mrs. Kate Fox Jenkin, as she came to be known, and her husband were met in the early 70s in good social circles in London, and her services were eagerly sought after. One observer, Professor Bradshow of the University of St. Petersburg, who, after investigating her powers in London, wrote in an 1876 edition of The Spiritualist,
"From all that I was able to observe in the presence of Mrs. Jenkin, I am forced to come to the conclusion that the phenomena peculiar to her are of a strongly objective and convincing nature, and they would, I think, be sufficient for the most pronounced but honest skeptic to cause him to reject ventriloquism, muscular action, and every such artificial explanation of the phenomena."
By 1885, spiritualism was on the decline, and investigations of fraud began to increase. Margaret was called before a commission in New York to prove her skills. A test she failed miserably. Was this proof that she had no such gift after all? Or was it because she, like most days, was drunk at the time? Again, a matter for one's belief system there. Meanwhile, Kate saw the death of her beloved husband from a stroke. Heartbroken, she returned to New York, where, in early 1888, she was arrested for drunkenness and idleness, which led to welfare officers taking custody of her sons. This was much to the pleasure of the elder Fox sister Lee, who had entered into something of a public feud with her siblings, who she now viewed as something of an embarrassment, and she repeatedly raised concerns with the authorities over Kate's fitness as a mother. Margaret would eventually repair bridges with her younger sister and join her in England in 1876. And for a time being, this fraction of the Fox family appeared to be content with their lot in life, and the afterlife. But sadly, this could not be sustained, and tragedy would soon befall the family once again. In 1888, Maggie made the infamous appearance when she denounced spiritualism as a total sham. The years of alcohol abuse, loneliness, and grief had taken their toll on her, and she weighed the idea of committing suicide before finally choosing confession instead. She booked the stage at the New York Academy of Music and walked out on stage to announce that she and Kate had created the strange rappings heard in their Hydesville home all those years ago. The critics laughed and cried.
That is why I am willing to stay.
But the devoted spiritualists denounced Margaret's confessions as the ravings of a sad and tired drunk.
This is why you really can do it.
Well, I understand. Girl, just she didn't mean it.
This is why you should drink.
However, in 1891, Margaret would recant her confession, proclaiming that that had been the lie, not her spiritualism. Kate later drank herself to death in July of 1892, at the age of only 56. Her body was discovered by one of her sons, while Margaret died in March 1893 at the age of 59, in a friend's home in Brooklyn. Time has largely painted their case in a negative light, but the flip-flopping nature of Margaret's confession, combined with the account of numerous educated dignitaries professing their powers to be the indisputable truth, still leaves some spiritualists, to this day, well and truly foxed.